Recall the properties of radicals. See the box below. These properties are defined for the real numbers. The square root of 80. Well, 80 is also 16 times 5. So you can break this up into two radicals. The square root of 16 times the square root of 5. The square root of 16 is 4. And we can't reduce the square root of 5 anymore, so it's 4 times the square root of 5. For the square root of 12 times x squared, we can break this up into 4 times 3 times x squared, and break that into three different radicals. This one becomes 2 because the square root of 4 is 2. So 2 times the square root of 3 times the absolute value of x. Because if we take the square root of x squared, we get the absolute value of x. For c, we have the square root of 64 times m to the 4th power times n squared. Break that up into three different radicals. The square root of 64 is 8. The square root of m to the 4th is m to the 2nd. And the square root of n to the 2nd is the absolute value of n. Finally, we have d. 4 times the square root of 125 x cubed times y squared. So we can break this up into three different radicals. So we have 25 times 5, x squared times x. So x to the 3rd becomes x squared times x. And the square root of y squared. That becomes 20 times x times the absolute value of y times the square root of 5x. So basically, this portion here becomes 5. That goes out front. 5 times 4 is 20. For x squared times x, this portion becomes this x, whereas the square root of x, one of these is left, and that ends up here. The 5 is left over, and that becomes this 5 here. And the square root of y squared gives us the absolute value of y. The properties of radicals apply to the real numbers. To manage negative radicals, there is one property that we'll need to embrace. If a is greater than 0, the square root of negative a equals I times the square root of a. So let's simplify these. Square root of negative 16, so a here is 16, therefore this equals I times the square root of a, which is 16. So I times the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4, so this becomes 4i. Negative square root of 48. So we can take that negative sign out, replace it with an I out front, and then 48 is 16 times 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So we can take a 4 out, and we're left with the square root of 3 times I times 4. The square root of negative 200. First step's always to take the negative sign out and replace it with an I, and then solve this radical as we normally would. 200 becomes 100 times 2. Separate those into two different radicals that are multiplied together. The square root of 100 is 10, so we have 10 times I times the square root of 2. Finally, we have the square root of negative 16 times the square root of negative 4. So in both of these situations here, we take the I out front, get rid of the negative sign, and then we have the square root of, this becomes 4 because that's the square root of 16, and so 4i times 2i, since the square root of 4 is 2, and then multiply 4 and 2 together, and the I together, 8 times I squared, and as we've previously learned, I squared is negative 1, so we end up with negative 8. Simplify. The square root of negative 15 times the square root of negative 30. Alright, first thing I'm going to do is take the negative signs out by adding I. So I times the square root of 15 times I times the square root of 30. Then I'm going to combine these radicals. The radical 15 times the radical 30 is the radical of 450. 15 times 30 is 450. And I'm also going to multiply the i's together. I times I is I squared. 450 we're going to break apart into two different radicals. 225 times the square root of 2. Because 450 is 225 times 2, so we can break those into two different radicals. This portion here is 15. So we have I squared still. So we have 15 times I squared times the square root of 2. I squared is negative 1. So this becomes negative 15 times the square root of 2. All right, moving on, we have the square root of negative 16x squared. First thing I'll do is take out the negative sign. So we have I times the square root of 16x squared. That becomes the square root of That becomes the square root of 16 times the square root of x squared. The square root of 16 is 4, so that becomes 4 times I times the square root of x squared. The square root of x squared is absolute value of x, so we have 4 times I times the absolute value of x. Negative 15 times the square root of 2, and 4i times the absolute value of x. Simplify. Negative the square root of negative 45a squared. First step, take out this negative sign. So we'll have an I out front times the square root of 45a squared. 45 is 9 times 5, so if we break that up into different radicals, like that, square root of 9 times the square root of 5 times the square root of a squared, this is all equivalent to this. Then we can take the square root of 9, which is 3, so we have negative 3, so now we got rid of that one. I times the absolute value of a, because the square root of a squared is the absolute value of a, times the square root of 5, which we cannot simplify further. So that is our answer. All right, over here, first what we're going to do is take the negative signs out. So we have I times the square root of 3m to the third times I times the square root of 27m. Now what I'm going to do is combine these radicals together. So first I'm going to combine the i's together. I times I is I squared. Then I have a radical. 3 times 27 is 81. M to the third times m is m to the fourth. So that's all under the radical. Now we're going to break this up into two radicals. I squared times the square root of 81 times the square root of m to the fourth. So then this is 9. So we have 9 times I squared times m squared, because the square root of m to the fourth is m squared. I squared is negative 1, so that gives us negative 9 times m squared. And there we go.